Welcome back to week 2 of Black Voices Matters. Let's take a moment to remember Alex Haley, who on this day, February the 10th, 1992, passed away. Alex Haley is best remembered for his writings, specifically two amazing books that he wrote. One, Roots, the Saga of an American Family, and the other, Queen, the Story of an American Family. If you would like to learn more about Alex Haley, please visit our resource group SharePoint site. Welcome. I am Danielle Hairston-Green, Institute Director for Human Development and Relationships, Chairperson for the African American Employee Resource Group, and District 530 Representative for the Academic Staff Council with UW-Madison. Thank you for sharing your lunch hour with the African American Employee Resource Group, affectionately known as AAERG, as we continue to engage you in meaningful dialogue during our inaugural Black Voices Matter discussion series in recognition of Black History Month. The AAERG purpose is to serve as a resource for and foster current and future African American colleagues' success by sponsoring programming, providing collegial support, encouraging belonging, and raising a collective voice related to issues that impact employees' ability to thrive personally and professionally. We will love your feedback and will provide a link to a survey in the chat box as we close out this session today. I want to first give acknowledgement to a few of our committee members. Don Danita Fleury-Simmons, the co-chair of AAERG, as well as the chairperson for the Professional Development Committee. Rick Mills, the secretary and the committee interim chairperson for the Members and Events Committee. Eva Terry, the treasurer. Angie Allen, historian. James Bowling, Retention and Recruitment Committee chairperson, and Hawadia Thompson, the chairperson for Marketing and Media. I'm thrilled to introduce to you our second scholar, author, educator, Dr. Mark Shappy, pronouns he, him, is an associate professor of philosophy at Prairie View A&M University. He is also the program coordinator for general studies and teaches the honor colloquium in the fall semesters. For 5 years, he has co-instructed the Human Rights and Medicine course at Baylor College of Medicine. He has published a wide range of research, including work on the role of guessing and logical thinking, the virtues of cultural humility, and how to address microaggressions. He has presented work on microaggressions to audiences across the globe, including to medical school students, clinicians, and legal professionals in the United States, Namibia, as well as South Africa. Currently, he is working on issues of ethics and social justice in cybersecurity and education. I've had the pleasure to work with Dr. Shappy on a microaggression research project. We co-coordinated and supervised 20 graduate students at Prairie View A&M University, where we explored 5 dimensions of microaggressions: body shaming, race, sex, disability, and gender. Our colleagues have since presented the results of that research on various national platforms. Dr. Shappy will be presenting Unearthing and Understanding Microaggressions for Inclusion and Improved Communication. During this presentation, he will provide an overview of what microaggressions are, how they are often committed, and offer techniques we may use to address them by using examples, critical analysis, and suggestions. You will be provided with tools to facilitate enhancing awareness and overcoming obstacles to inclusion and communication caused by microaggressions. Without further ado, I would like to introduce to you Dr. Mark D. Shappy.
See my PowerPoint on the screen. Okay, great. So as Danielle mentioned, I do go by the preferred gender pronouns he, him, and his. The reason I'm mentioning this is as a step toward alleviating microaggressions. This is actually something to start doing. This is something that's becoming an important professional standard to present what your preferred gender pronouns are for inclusion, for the sake of including others. So I just wanted to mention that. And let's see. Okay, before we begin, just a couple general notes. Number one, everyone commits microaggressions, including me. In fact, at the end of these talks, and I've given various versions of these talks, I usually realize that I said something that I wish I would have said differently. I commit them, you commit them, and even people who are most often the target of microaggressions commit them. None of us are above committing microaggressions at all. In order to understand what they are and how we might address them, it's important, and I can't stress this enough, not to take a defensive stance, to actually be receptive and to kind of, remove that armor of defense for a moment. This is one of the reasons that it's important that we realize that all of us commit microaggressions. We understand microaggressions best when we take an attitude of humility. So humility can really be divided into 4 fundamental aspects with regard to this. 1 is I ask you to be open-minded. 2 is I ask you to be responsible for your actions or your reactions. This includes in terms of questions, and please reserve your questions for the end. Be wholehearted in your interest. And finally, be ready to learn and reflect upon your habits. And we'll talk about that a bit at the very end. Also, just some preferred terms that you might notice that I bring up throughout the talk. One is that the term minority or minorities is replaced with minoritized persons. The reason for this is that it doesn't essentialize the idea of someone who is in a group that's minoritized. It actually refers to the fact that being minoritized is an action that is done to a group rather than something that that group embodies, okay? Also, the term Black is used to refer to race. African American is used to refer to a specific identity within that broader category. Latinx, Latina, Latino are used by me typically instead of Hispanic, although these ethnic terms are usually preferred according to geographic region. There's an interesting history behind this that I can't get into right now. Latinx is actually more common in California. Hispanic is much more common here in Texas, where I am. White is used to refer to race instead of Caucasian. There's a whole other lecture that I give on why the term Caucasian is problematic. And this is something that I advocate, is replacing this kind of outdated racist term Caucasian with the term white. And finally, I will on occasion use the phrase persons of color. I don't replace this with anything. However, I only use this when generally speaking of groups who are non-white. Okay, so these are just some preferred terms that I use that some people might not be used to, especially the term minoritized persons. So what are microaggressions? This is a term that's been bandied about a lot, especially since the early 2000s until now. It's actually a term that goes back to 1970. In 1970, the Black psychiatrist named Dr. Chester Pierce wanted to understand the experiences that he and other psychiatrists who were Black were having, especially at professional meetings, where they could feel as though there was some kind of racism at work, but they didn't know exactly what to call it because it wasn't overt. It wasn't something that they could pinpoint easily. And so Pierce came up with the term microaggressions. Now, interestingly, Pierce did not do a lot of work on microaggressions in the 70s. I mean, he was a practicing psychiatrist. That's really what he focused on more than anything. And so the term kind of went out of usage or didn't really come into usage until the early 2000s. And that's when a social work professor by the name of Darrell Dwing Sue started really using the term and popularizing the term in his work. And his definition is the definition that we'll be using today. And the definition is basically microaggressions are the brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, and environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional. And that's an important aspect of this, is that many microaggressions are unintentional, although some are intentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial, gender, sexual orientation, and religious slights and insults to the target person or group. as mentioned in the intro, this actually expands even more so. There's been work done, very important work that was done by students at Prairie View, for instance, on microaggressions and body shaming, which is not included in this particular definition. But microaggressions really can apply with regard to any particular identity or group. And I think you'll see how that works, or hopefully you'll see how that works. Hopefully I'll be able to show you how that works in a moment. In terms of understanding microaggressions, it's important to look at their subdivisions that Sue has laid out. And so microaggressions, generally speaking, are considered covert acts of discrimination. Oftentimes the person committing microaggressions, who we might also call the aggressor, is unaware, or they don't recognize that they're committing the microaggression. You'll notice that the first category of these, I've actually crossed out micro. And the reason for that is because, and this is something actually Ibram Kendi brings up in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, is that microaggressions can be viewed as a misnomer. Oftentimes they are explicit. And so explicit derogatory behavior, for example, shaming based on assumptions concerning sexuality or promiscuity, for instance, using racial slurs, these are assaults, although sometimes they are referred to as micro assaults. I think it better to remove or to overtly show the erasure of micro in front of assault in these cases. There are also micro insults. These are specifically dismissive or exclusionary comments. So these are not explicitly derogatory, although if we look closely enough, we see that they are dismissive and they are exclusionary. For example, a person who says to a female doctor, "Excuse me, where is the doctor? I would like to speak to him," is an example of a micro insult. And I'll go over other examples as well in a moment. And then finally, there's the category of micro invalidation. And this is really when the feelings or the experiences of another person are excluded, negated, or nullified. So for example, kind of the classic micro invalidation is someone saying, "You're just being sensitive. Nothing's really happening. You're just being too sensitive. You're being hypersensitive." Now, before I get into what we could consider person-to-person microaggressions, I do want to mention that microaggressions are also environmental. And this is especially true within spaces like campuses. So the atmosphere is discriminatory. For example, a campus climate can be hostile to certain groups. One of the examples that Daryl Dwing-Sue uses is when he was brought in as a consultant at Columbia to find out why they had such a problem retaining administrators who were non-white and non-male. He went into the boardroom, looked around, and he said, "Look at the portraits you have." And they were all of white men. That's an example of an environmental microaggression. It may also include medical settings that are non-inclusive. Again, it's really important to recognize that representation is everything. When a hospital or a clinic only has photographs and paintings depicting white male doctors and female nurses, that's an example of an environmental microaggression. And I imagine that by the end of this talk, you'll be able to think of quite a few environmental microaggressions that you run into in various spaces. So in terms of the subdivisions of person-to-person microaggressions, I'll begin with assaults, or what were known as microassaults. Again, these are explicitly derogatory. And I think one of the most important things to recognize about how these types of assaults work is that there are really three conditions that facilitate them. One of the things to think of as I'm talking through this is how phenomena like trolling works on the internet. You'll notice that the conditions that I'm talking about really allow for the types of aggressions that take place in spaces like the internet. The first condition is that perpetrators often feel an anonymity that allows their roles or actions to be concealed. So for instance, they'll get on Twitter and they'll be using a handle that hides who they are, and they feel as though that anonymity will allow them to say whatever they want. 2, perpetrators often feel safe because they're around people who share their beliefs and attitudes. It's amazing what people will actually say when they're around others that they believe are like-minded rather than when they're alone. And finally, a loss of emotional control. So privately held beliefs are unleashed at the height of frustration and emotion. One of the examples that Gerald Wing-Sue uses is when Michael Richards, who played Kramer in Seinfeld, he was doing, this is about 20 years ago now, he was doing a stand-up routine, and he was very annoyed by a group of audience members who were persons who were Black. And as he grew more and more frustrated, he suddenly burst into racist slurs. That's an example of, again, a condition that facilitates this type of assaults, that at that brink of emotional loss of control, he was not able to hold in those beliefs that he had held. Some examples of micro insults. So we've talked about assaults, and those are the most obvious ones. But micro insults are the ones that you might look at and you have heard them a lot, or you might have even committed them before. These are covertly dismissive, generalizing, or exclusionary. And Sue gives kind of generalized names to some of them. So for instance, one is the ascription of intelligence. So for instance, telling someone, you're a credit to your race. This is a classic example of a micro insult. Now, when we think about this, people who are white are never told you are a credit to your race. And the reason for that is because oftentimes it's assumed that a person who is white is intelligent. Non-white persons are often told this. And so again, if you analyze this, if you think about what this phrase really means, it's stating other people within whatever group I'm identifying you with are not typically intelligent from my point of view, but you are a credit to that group. Another example of a micro insult is criminality or assumption of criminal status. An example is a store owner follows a person of color around the store. Another example is someone is walking down the street and they clutch their purse as a person of a particular group comes closer to them. Not taking the elevator, for instance, when someone of a particular group is already on the elevator or walks onto the elevator with them. Another example of a micro insult is the use of the pronoun he to refer to all people. This is something that oftentimes does not get called out at all, in part because it's written into government documents, but this is also problematic. Finally, pathologizing cultural values or communication styles. This is the general category, and I'm sure that all of us can think of different examples of this. So for instance, asking a person, why do, and then insert an ethnic group, a racial, or a sexuality group into those brackets, have to be so loud or animated. Another is on kind of the opposite spectrum. Why do, again, insert a group, need to be so quiet and deferential? Again, these are generalizing and they're exclusionary, and they also have this tendency of treating a group as if they are all the same and somehow fundamentally abnormal. Other examples are treating people as a second-class citizen. So for instance, a person of color is mistaken for a service worker. So for instance, someone is attending a banquet, and because of their race or their ethnicity, they are mistaken as a person who's serving at the tables. Another is a female doctor is mistaken for a nurse. This is something that actually happened on an American Airlines flight a few years ago, that the staff of American Airlines refused to believe, this was actually a woman at University of Texas, refused to believe that she was a female doctor. and kept insisting that she was a nurse and that she was lying. Another example is sexual objectification. So whistles and catcalls as a woman walks down the street, or really anyone walks down the street, but obviously this tends to happen to women more than anyone else. Also commenting on a person's body or dress, especially in a sexual manner, assuming that it's quote unquote just a compliment. And then finally, and I'd mention this kind of as a broader category, the assumption of abnormality. So for instance, students using the term gay to describe a student who's socially ostracized at school. This is a micro insult. Commenting on an aspect of Mexican American culture as if it is quote unquote weird or strange. And the question that should automatically be raised is, opposed to what? In contrast to what? What is being taken as the norm here? Some more micro insults, and I bring up a lot of these because these are really microaggressions that are committed quite a bit, and oftentimes they are thought of as complimentary, when in fact they really are not taken as complimentary by the person who receives them. For instance, you're so articulate. Again, I'm sure you can imagine that there are entire groups who are never told, you're so articulate. I have never been told after a talk, you're so articulate. Also, you are our token, and then whatever group that person fits into is another example of a micro insult. And then finally, you have what we could call essentializing race or ethnicity. Because of your race or ethnicity, you must be good at, and then insert an activity, sports, math, music, dance, etc. These are all examples of micro insults because what they do is they undermine individual ability, individual talent, and they overgeneralize, acting as if there's something with regard to the identity of a group that is essential to that group. And finally, in terms of micro insults with regard to race and ethnicity, and it's funny because there was a discussion of names before we started, mocking a person's name. And oftentimes this happens with regard to names that are unfamiliar to a certain group. So purposely mispronouncing or claiming not to be able to learn how to pronounce their name correctly. Yes, there are names with which we are all unfamiliar. However, the task of learning those names is on us, not on the person who has been named. And this relates to the next one, insisting that they accept a nickname that you have ascribed to them rather than their own name. Claiming that their name is strange or weird is another example of a micro insult. I think somebody has their mic on. Thank you. Some examples of micro insults are with regard to gender specifically. This relates to he, use of the term mankind for humanity. Humanity is much more than mankind. Assumptions because of a person's gender. So when are you going to have kids is an example of a micro insult that is oftentimes levied especially at women. And gendering certain objects or parts of a person. Why do you wear your hair like a girl? Why do you dress like a girl? Why do you dress like a boy? That's all examples of gendering. Not using the pronoun that a person prefers. This is quite a big deal. The kind of example I use for people who don't see why this is a big deal is I want you to imagine that someone has a child and they present that child as he, she, or they, whatever the preferred pronoun is that they decide on. And yet someone insists on referring to the child by the pronoun it. And I want you to think of how offensive that would be. The same is true with regard to misidentifying someone in terms of calling them a pronoun they don't prefer. There's also, this relates to what's known as dead naming. And I imagine that most of you have heard of this before, but I think it bears repeating. Dead naming is using someone's birth name instead of a name that they have selected. So that's an example. So for instance, let's say that I was named at birth Mary instead of Mark, and I prefer to go by Mark, and I present myself as Mark, but someone insists on calling me my birth name. That's an example of dead naming, which is an incredibly traumatic experience for people who go through that. So that's another example of a micro insult. And finally, there are examples of micro invalidations. Remember, these exclude, they negate, or they nullify others' experiences or feelings. And kind of the two big ones that we hear most often are, you're just being too sensitive, or this is just political correctness. Political correctness has become this kind of excuse of sorts to negate other people's experiences. And I think what you'll find is that when we address microaggressions, what we're doing is we're addressing actually something that is a pretty fundamental experience that people have. And if we're addressing them well, it's making all of our experiences much better. This is not simply some kind of tyrannical imposition of rules that are unnecessary. Some examples of micro-invalidations are to treat someone as if they're an alien in one's own land. So for example, asking, where are you from? No, where were you born? I've had students, especially students who are Latinx, who have recounted having to deal with this quite a bit. I'm in Houston, and Prairie View is just outside of Houston. So a lot of my students are from Texas, and some of them are Latinx. And people will ask them, well, where are you from? And they'll say, oh, I'm from the Dallas area. And they'll say, no, where were you born? As if there's no way that they could actually be from the United States at all. Another example is color blindness. When I look at you, I don't see race. Why is this a micro-invalidation? Because it completely and utterly invalidates someone's experience as raced, as a racial experience. It attempts to erase racial experience. Another one is there are no races, we're all one race, the human race. This is an example of equivocation. When we use the phrase human race, we're referring to race in one way. When we refer to something like my race is white, that is referring to race in a very different way. There are two entirely different histories to these terms used in those two ways. Another is denial of individual racism, sexism, or heterosexism. I'm not racist, or I'm not sexist, or I'm not homophobic. I have many Black friends, or female friends, or gay friends, or trans friends, or whatever you want to insert into that. Those are examples of trying to deny one's prejudices simply based on a kind of tokenism. And this is an example when I speak to medical students and people within clinics, of course I can't be racist. I see many Black patients, or of course I can't be sexist. I see many female patients, or of course I can't be homophobic. I see very many gay patients. That does not negate the fact that someone is committing microaggressions or that someone holds these prejudices. And finally, the myth of meritocracy. The excuse, I believe everyone has the same chances in life. It's astounding when people are interviewed after job interviews, job candidates who are Black are reported to have heard the phrase, we give everyone an equal chance here, far more than any other racial group or ethnic group in interviews. By the same respect, women are told this far more than men are. We're giving everyone an equal opportunity. It's based on the individual. So for instance, most white men are not being told this in job interviews. So why do microaggressions occur? Well, I think that at the core, they can be traced to a core micro insult, which is the pathologizing of cultural values or communication styles. So remember, this is pathologizing cultural values or pathologizing communication styles is a micro insult. And it's based on the belief that certain types of cultural values and communication styles, so for example, if we're in the United States, traditionally this means white, cis male. Cis is just, if you're not familiar with that, is a prefix that means same. And it refers to someone who identifies with the same gender that they were ascribed with when they were born. So white, cis male, heterosexual, usually Christian, and masculine are considered the standard or norm, while all other cultural values and communication styles are considered abnormal. When we get into discussions of diversity, oftentimes the standard against which diversity is measured is this standard within the United States. And that alone is problematic because from that stems this idea that every other identity is somehow lesser or different or less valuable when contrasted with this. So who are typically affected by microaggressions? Everyone. Everyone's affected by microaggressions. There is no group that is not a victim of microaggressions. There is also not a group who is the only target of microaggressions. Everyone, at some time or another, is the target of microaggressions. And that's very important because oftentimes when I give this talk or when others give talks on microaggressions, there are certain individuals in certain groups who think, oh, well, this is about how I'm a bad person and I'm the only one committing microaggressions. No, everybody commits them and everyone has them committed against them. However, there are some groups who are more often targets of microaggressions than others. One is persons of color, persons who are Black, Latinx, Latina, Latino, Native American. So for example, Tongva or Oneida, and of Asian lineage as well. Persons of color are targeted with regard to microaggressions far more than persons who are white. Transgender persons are also targets of microaggressions. Persons who are gender fluid or gender queer are also targets, as are intersex persons who are oftentimes completely forgotten about in discussions of sex or the sexing of individuals. Persons who do not identify as heterosexual are oftentimes targets of microaggressions, persons who are non-Christian, and persons living with disabilities or chronic illness. I could add other groups to this. As I mentioned at the beginning, people with certain body types are often the targets of microaggressions. People of certain ages are often the target of microaggressions. Microaggressions oftentimes depend upon context. What environment is one in? Is someone minoritized in that environment? So why should we care about this? Why should we have anything to do with worrying about microaggressions? Well, there are effects of them. And throughout the last 20 years, there have been more and more studies that have indicated the effects of microaggressions. Some of the experiences of microaggressions include feeling diminished receptivity and understanding. In other words, feeling as though one is not heard or one is not understood, a lower quality of life, and lower trust in others. Perceiving that one is being discriminated against causes stress. It causes discouragement from seeking help. I hadn't mentioned this at the beginning. The way that I even got into the study of microaggressions was that I used to do a lot of work with regard to HIV and AIDS. And so one of the things I was doing work on is how persons living with HIV experience microaggressions. And one of the problems that persons living with HIV experience is adherence to treatment. And the reason that many people living with HIV have a problem adhering to treatment is because they're discouraged from seeking help because of the microaggressions that they experience in the clinic. And it also includes difficulties sustaining trust. The effects of microaggressions build over time. Dr. Pierce referred to this as death by 1,000 cuts. They cause anxiety, they cause depression, avoidance and fear of settings, and avoidance of people who frequently commit microaggressions. There have been studies that indicate that Black women within the United States, by the time that many of them are in their 40s, have experienced the equivalent of PTSD because of microaggressions. So these have very real physical effects. Persons feel a loss of autonomy and voice, what's often called epistemic injustice. They start to doubt themselves. They start to doubt, did I really experience this? Did this person really say this? Am I just imagining things? So what are the sources of microaggressions? Well, I would say that there are three major sources. The first one is ignorance. This is just the unquestioning belief that one's actions or attitudes are correct. Going all the way back to Plato, ignorance is to believe of what is false that it is true, or to believe of what is true that it is false. Also, implicit bias, the unconscious or suppressed values that are often at odds with one's explicit beliefs. So although a person might claim not to be biased, we all have biases, and we all have to be more critically reflective upon those biases. And then finally, stereotyping. Again, going back to micro insults, these are broad categorizations of individuals based upon group identity. All of these sources, by the way, are reinforced within cultures and in groups. It's not as if we are simply individuals acting alone who simply have some mistaken beliefs. But oftentimes our false beliefs don't really appear to affect us too badly. In fact, if you think about it, we get away with a great amount of false beliefs because they most often don't threaten our way of life. If you really stop and think about it, at any family gathering, at least 50% of what's being said is probably based in a false belief. But the reason that we don't question them is because it doesn't really affect us too much. So for instance, someone can hold the belief that, let's say that an alien species lives in the center of the earth, and that's not really going to affect us too much. A lot of our beliefs don't really affect what we do, and yet we still hold them. However, this doesn't excuse our ignorance, our bias, or our stereotyping. So how do we address these? Well, the first thing we have to do is we have to appreciate difference. We need to difference from ourselves. We need to recognize and appreciate that difference provides receptivity to different narratives that speak from outside of what the author Audre Lorde calls mythical norms. And again, all of us are raised with mythical norms. We're all raised thinking that there's some kind of baseline of normalcy by which everything else is judged. The problem is there is no essentialized normalcy. In fact, this is very relative to who we are, to how we live, to what groups we're around. And I mean, Lorde does note, change means growth, and growth can be painful. And even listening to some of these, they might be painful. Some people might think, ooh, I've done that before. And I can go back through and I can talk about how at different stages of my life, I committed some of these microaggressions that I now talk about. It doesn't mean that I'm proud of committing them. However, there's an importance to moving past them. We have to get over the falsehoods that we've learned, and that's really difficult. And it's going to take patience and effort. It's not like one talk is going to do that. So how do we diminish microaggressions? And this is where, and one of the things I believe in is not just talking about these concepts, but actually providing tools. When we are in any situation of interaction, we need to grant people the following to facilitate overcoming microaggressions. One is that we need to recognize that people are self-determined. We shouldn't be the ones determining others. We also need to grant people respect for their experiences, respect for what they're bringing to the table. Also, acknowledge and appreciate difference, truly acknowledge and appreciate it. This is the belief in pluralism. Don't fall into the color, gender, culture blindness trap. I don't see color, I just see the individual. Again, what that does is it undermines not only our own comportment towards the world, but it also undermines the experiences that people actually have. Driving while Black is fundamentally different in the United States than driving while white. When somebody says, I don't see color, they are not recognizing that fundamental difference in experience, which is a crucial difference and is a very important difference with regard to understanding many problems that occur in this country. We have to develop open communication, so allow persons to be self-determining. This includes not interrupting and being patient when it comes to providing silence and space for people to speak or be heard. One of the biggest problems many of us have is waiting for somebody to finish. We like to jump in and presume that we know exactly what they're going to say or where they're coming from. We need to listen with openness. This is not the same as politeness. And anyone who has ever had, a problem and has tried to talk with somebody about that problem and they've simply been given kind of lip service knows exactly what I'm talking about. Someone can say, I hear what you're saying. Yes, we're going to address that. And you know that nothing is being heard at all. There's a big difference between listening with openness and simply going through a kind of checklist of what to do when someone is making a complaint. Receive and respect persons on their own terms without qualifying it. Oh, well, this person is angry because they're this type of person. No, just receive and respect them. Be receptive to them. Alleviate predetermined standards of behavior, status, or identity that curtail listening. An example of this is binary gender norms. Oh, well, you're either a man or a woman, and a man does this and a woman does that. But other examples are things like pedigree. Oh, you went to this particular school, so that means you're going to be like this. That means I'm going to listen to you this much instead of this much. Also recognize that we can share meaning without having total overlap in meaning. Just because you don't experience something. So one of the classic retorts to microaggressions is, that's not what I experience, does not disqualify another person's experience. Just because you haven't experienced it, one, doesn't mean that another person is not truly experiencing it, and also doesn't mean that it's not real. In fact, when there is that kind of discrepancy, I would advise listening even more closely because there's that difference. Appreciate difference without attempting to completely identify. This is something that I imagine all of us have experienced to some degree or another, is that you're expressing why you think something is wrong, and someone says, I know exactly how you feel. No, you don't know exactly how I feel because you don't occupy my position. And I can't know exactly how you feel because I don't occupy your position. Again, that doesn't mean we can't communicate. That doesn't mean that we simply have to go our separate ways. We can have shared meaning, but let's not try to act as if we have this kind of complete and utter empathy where I can feel precisely what another person feels. When listening, it's incredibly important to listen without thinking ahead. And I think all of us have to work on this. This is something that I strive to work on, especially in terms of teaching. Don't just assume that you know what the person is going to say. Yes, this might resemble another situation that you've been in. Yes, this might be within a context where you typically hear a certain type of thing. But it's always important to wait out and actually listen to what the person is saying, rather than presuming you're going to know exactly what they're going to say. If you look at the, so when I'm talking to clinicians, if you look at the amount of time that clinicians give patients to speak, it's usually less than 10 seconds before they interrupt them and presume that they know exactly what they're saying. And part of the reason for that is because they're taught expediency. But one of the problems with that is that it alienates the patient. And the patient feels oftentimes that one, they're not heard, but also that there's simply no bother in going to the clinician because they won't be listened to. So engage in real dialogue. Provide a comfortable context for discussion. Be mindful of the fact that even if you don't intend it, you might be communicating some sort of discrimination. And when it does occur, try to seek remedies and improvements. And a lot of this is going to have to do with questioning how we act and what we say and what others have told us is going on. So what are some tools for addressing microaggressions? Number one, and I said this at the beginning, drop defensive posturing. Immediately we hear we're doing something wrong and the armor goes up, right? The shields go up. All of a sudden, I couldn't be doing that. There's no way that I could be racist. There's no way that I could be sexist. There's no way that I could be homophobic. That's not the important part. The important part isn't the words that go along with it. The important part is working toward alleviating these actions that are problematic. And again, we all commit them. Question conceptions of duty and responsibility. We have to get away from this blame the victim mentality. Well, you're upset because you're playing the victim. That's why you're having this experience. We need to get away from that. We need to question how we actually conceive of the responsibilities that we have with regard to how another person feels treated. Honestly reflect upon your own influences and attitudes. And again, this goes along with dropping defensive posturing. Critically assess your beliefs, even your most deeply held beliefs. Critically assess those. We cannot grow without inquiry. And finally, engage in moral imagination exercises. Moral imagination is just entertaining counterfactuals. In other words, what if this were the case? If I were to react this way, what would happen? If I were, for instance, let's say a person is angry about something that I did, and they've said that I've said something that's offended them. Maybe instead of trying to make a joke, what would happen if I listen, if I actually am receptive? When I do make a joke, what tends to happen? Well, it doesn't alleviate the situation, it tends to make the situation worse. But again, it's very difficult to engage and truly question our habits because we grow so accustomed to doing them, and oftentimes they seem fine. They don't affect us in the way that they're affecting others. So finally, what I'd like you to do is I'd like to give you some questions for self-reflection. And these are just things that I'd like you to sit with and take away with you and really ponder. And I want you to notice I do not have why questions here. I have what questions and how questions. And there's a very particular reason for that. What attitudes toward persons might I convey that could be interpreted as exclusionary? What are behaviors in which I have engaged and or engage in that might be experienced as discriminatory by others, especially those who are not in my own in-group? Be honest with yourself. What beliefs do I have with regard to certain identities of persons that I would be hesitant to admit or deny having in the presence of those persons? So when I was talking about race, when I was talking about gender, when I was talking about sexuality, are there certain identities that you truly have not faced your own feelings about, your own beliefs about, that you have not called into question? What am I doing in a humble manner to be more receptive and learn more about the experiences of persons with whom my identity differs? I think this is one of the most important things to ask. When I talk with medical students, one of the things we talk about is reading and listening to narratives from people who are of different identities than themselves. Because you truly, especially if you're practicing medicine, you have to try to understand that person's perspective. No, you're never going to occupy that perspective, but it's amazing how much you can learn just by being receptive to someone else's narrative. How may I best monitor my behavior so as to prevent microaggressions? I definitely advocate this for anybody, for everyone, but especially within the workplace, especially if you're in a leadership position. How can I keep myself in check so that I'm not committing this? And by the way, I mean, I do this not only in my capacity as an administrator, but also as a professor, perhaps even more so as a professor. How do I monitor my behavior to best prevent committing microaggressions against my students? And also, how do I teach my students how to best monitor themselves? How do I pause during interaction so that I'm mindful of my reactive habits that are problematic? All of us snowball at times. And what I mean by that is all of a sudden we're in the thick of somebody saying that we did something wrong, or we know that this is a situation in which we've offended somebody. And instead of stopping and listening, we launch into a defense and we get reactionary. How do we stop ourselves from doing that? How do we pause? And finally, how do I convey to persons that I'm receptive to their experiences? How can I improve my persona to better convey that receptivity? So this isn't about changing what they experience. This is, how do I change my own persona, my own habits, so that I'm receptive to their experience? Thank you very much for listening to me. I think we have a little bit of time for questions.
Absolutely. This is an opportunity for you guys to post some questions. I know that there was a couple comments in the chat box, and we'll make sure we get those amazing comments to Dr. Shappy. But I did see one question specifically about invalidation. This came from Dominic Ledesma. And Dominic is our director for access and inclusion. And Dominic, I don't know if you want to elaborate, but he was mentioning that he has this role where there are oftentimes colleagues that will come to him and ask for advice about how to deal with issues, especially dealing with equity and inclusion and diversity within our organization, and oftentimes being challenged to prove that this is an issue, prove it to us. And so, you know, his comment is that, you know, being in that position, do you feel like that is another example of an invalidation? What would be your advice? And he also would like to chop it up with you sometimes to deep dive into more dialogue.
No, thank you for the question. Yeah, it is. It's one of the, I mean, it's a really classic example of an invalidation, because what it does is it undermines the person's experience. Oh, you must be imagining things. I didn't intend that, so it can't be true. Now, regardless of what a person's intentions are, if that's what the person is feeling, that's what they're feeling. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't open up a dialogue about why this is occurring. But the invalidation comes at not even listening to what the experience is, but rather focusing on this notion of proof. Proof is not important here. What's important is this is what's been experienced. And I can share with you how that experience has occurred. But once we start talking about proof, notice how this burden of responsibility has shifted. And now it's not about, this is the way I feel. Now it's about, well, I have to somehow make this case of sorts. This is not a legal case like that. This is, look, this is the experience that I'm having. And you may not have intended for me to have that experience. And if not, that's great. But now what we have to do is we need to actually converse about what's going wrong here. Because regardless of what the intention is, there's a problem. And to start talking about proof is to act, well, if you can't supply this proof, then we don't really have a problem. And my automatic response to that is, what would the criteria for proof be? And there isn't one at all. So let's acknowledge that there's a problem because somebody has said, this is the way I feel, and hopefully we can address that.
Can I color that with some perspective?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, please.
So for example, this past summer, we had an institution-wide dialogue on why decentering whiteness is difficult in extension and everywhere else. But the sort of the poke at it, the challenge it, is based on the assumption that there isn't literature around this, that there isn't scholarship that's done in this, or that it's not quality scholarship. It doesn't constitute you know, the scholarships that's done via the scientific method in a scientific way. And so that's the sort of the piece right there when we try to center these issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion in a PWI, and then to see folks kind of, you know, challenge that, like, well, where's the literature on this? It invalidates the area of professional specialization, not to mention the, you know, the folks who are trying to get behind this to talk about these issues. There's always that undermining of like, well, this isn't, did you pull this from Facebook? Are these from Facebook posts? Or you know, it's not in the literature, or at least not in the literature that I read, for example. That's what I'm talking about, that the canon of research that at least folks within an academic institution expect to see like backed up and cited in order to have conversations around whiteness, around other issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. The messy stuff, the good stuff.
Yeah, I mean, the ultimate question again is, what is the criteria by which something fits into the canon? The aegis of responsibility, when somebody says like this literature doesn't count, the question is, why is this literature discounted? What basis is there for discounting this literature? And what is the case is that there is no criteria proffered at all, or it's this kind of ad hoc criteria. There's plenty of peer-reviewed work that's been done on whiteness. You know, that's unquestionable. If somebody is saying, well, that work doesn't really count, what does count and why does it count? If the deference is to the scientific method, well, there is no thing called the scientific method. That's another area of work that I do. Scientific methodology has to do with different kinds of tools that we use. So again, I don't see the criteria by which someone tries to discount a very large and growing body of literature, excuse me, not only on microaggressions, but also on whiteness, also on inclusion, also on equity, etc.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for the questions and the comments. If there's any additional questions, I'll make sure that Dr. Shafi gets the information and he'll be able to respond. Thank you, Mark, for spending this amazing hour with us. As usual, your talks are always thoughtful, timely, and thought-provoking. On behalf of the AARG and our colleagues, our friends and partners of the Division of Extension, we hope we can call upon you to continue to engage us in meaningful dialogue. And please remember that for those of you who are listening, that microaggressions are about experiential reality and about listening to the voices of those who are oppressed, ignored, and silenced. As a reminder, Dr. Shafi's full bio and recording of today's session can be found only on our SharePoint site. We hope that you have enjoyed yourself and will return next week as we introduce our third speaker, Dr. Julianne Adams-Burt, who's a medical doctor and founder of Radiant Women's Health. And she will be joining us from Atlanta, Georgia to discuss accountability, the health disparities in the African-American community. There is a link in the chat box for your feedback. We need your feedback to continue to grow and strengthen our efforts. And thank you to everyone who joined this live discussion today, and to those who will be watching the recording. Thank you for taking the time to watch this phenomenal discussion. Have a wonderful afternoon and see you next week.